Hello. Hi. I'm Alex Fulton. I'm Head of Communications here at Sussex, and John has asked me to come along and help facilitate this session today, which, as you can all see, is on developing and disseminating research on social media. It's something I'm really interested in. I do my day job, so it's really great to be here. We're going to start off with a presentation from Dr. Mark Carrigan here, who I'll just introduce in a moment, and then following that, Kathleen is going to give her perspectives as an academic on what Mark's come here to talk to us about today. So just to introduce Mark, he is a digital sociologist and social media consultant and a digital fellow at the Sociological Review. He recently completed 3 years as a research fellow at the Centre of Social Ontology at the University of Warwick. He's an assistant editor of Big Data and Society and associate social media editor of the International Journal of Social Research Methodology and a founding member of the editorial boards of Discover Society and the Journal of Applied Social Theory. He's also the author of this really interesting book, Social Media for Academics, which is obviously very relevant to the people in the room, which was published by Sage last year. He's a former managing editor of the LSE's British Politics and Policy blog and continues to be a research associate at the LSE's Public Policy Group. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So after that introduction, which I'm aware probably needs a bit of editing now, so I'm sorry. Yeah, just to say, I think the theme for today is really nice because we think of dissemination and development as things that often go hand in hand, so they're separate activities, but they lead quite naturally from one to the other. So we engage in the actual research process, scholarship as a accumulated series of activities that produce research outputs. And then dissemination is something that is an increasing expectation, it's a newer expectation in the sense this is not something that we can take for granted, that increasingly there's an obligation that we're expected to engage in dissemination, also due to the competitive landscape of research. There's lots of other people writing, there's an estimated 2.5 million journal articles published every year, and in that landscape there's a pressure to try and do things that ensure that our work gets read. But nonetheless, they're seen as following effectively the same logic as one leading to the other. And this is a problem for social media because social media for research development, I would argue, works very differently to social media for research dissemination. For research development, it's often seen as something very challenging. It's a very new way of working. There's lots of concern about plagiarism, sharing ideas overly hastily, sharing your ideas in a way that will put journals off the process of actually publishing them. And I want to suggest that actually it's social media for research development that is most straightforwardly positive. And a lot of these concerns are, to a certain extent, founded on misunderstandings of how social media can be used to this end. And it's social media for research dissemination, which is often seen as the more straightforward topic, that actually, I want to suggest, is in some ways very problematic, and we have to be very careful about how we understand dissemination using social media, because there are some pitfalls we can fall into, and problems that I think are growing rapidly. And so I'll suggest that actually there are some common myths about social media for dissemination, that unless we address them, we risk, at best, spending a lot of time that could be better spent elsewhere on activity with little effect, and at worst actually encountering some really serious problems that I think are going to become more pronounced over time. So to start with then, I'll say a little bit about research development and then move on to research dissemination. In some ways going from a very positive bit of a talk to quite a negative, but hopefully on our footing there. So for research development, it is obviously something that varies a lot between disciplines and across fields, and it would be ridiculous for me to try and give an overview in 20 minutes, let alone 2 minutes. And at risk of a ridiculously hasty generalization, I suggest that in the arts and humanities and the social sciences, research development is still often a monological process. This is where the cliche of the scholar hermit comes in, where even if there are social aspects to it, there's still a lot of work that's undertaken individually, and the collective, collaborative, biological aspects of research development are ones that often take place in very formalised settings. Formalised presentations of work in progress, things like conferences, symposia, sharing drafts in relatively closed networks. And these lead us to produce these towering, finished, polished works. These books, these papers, these chapters, they're often obscure. The complexities, the confusion, the hard work, and the difficulties faced in producing this work. The backstage with these traditional forms of research development is occluded. We might obviously understand the difficulties that go into our own publications. We might see this firsthand in friends and colleagues and those we're close to. But for the most part, the public face of academic research outputs have tended to be restricted to these finished, polished pieces of work. And I find social media use by academics exciting because it's a way of opening up that backstage area, of revealing the scaffolding that goes in to the process of constructing a paper, constructing a book. And so the kinds of activities that I'm talking about for research development are straightforward, everyday things, such as identifying material and reflecting on it, developing arguments, cataloguing your engagements with literature, improving and refining your grasp on ideas. These are everyday scholarly activities that I think are so familiar. We tend not to think as reflexively about them as we could, at least past the stage of professional socialisation, training during a PhD, etc. And what's exciting about social media is not just that it offers new examples of what Pierre Bourdieu called intellectual technologies that we can use. The very fact of having these newer intellectual technologies and the opportunities to use them, it gives us cause to reflect on what we're doing already. It gives us cause to be more reflexive about our everyday activities. Not necessarily because social media's intellectual technologies are right for everyone. They're not, and I think the fact that we tend to have these conversations at the level of social media in general. I say, having spent the last 5 minutes using the phrase social media in exactly the way that I'm criticising, because it's hard not to in this kind of setting. But we need to disaggregate the category, not see social media in general as something academics in general either should all use or should all avoid. But instead see these additions to the tools available to us, new kinds of intellectual technologies, which each of us could use in different ways. And it's up to each of us to explore and to see if there are new ways of doing existing things that work more effectively for us. And so in this sense, we could see it as both and rather than either or. Not that these shiny new technologies should replace older ways of working, but actually that as our options for how to do our work expand, we should be open about the choices available to us and try and experiment and see what works for us, because the use of these intellectual technologies is so contextual. It depends on your career stage, your personal dispositions, your sensibility, your style of working, the topics you work on, the kind of institution you work in. The general advice about how academics should use social media or shouldn't, I think can actually muddy the water slightly. I say, having written a book called Social Media for Academics. So again, I'm very aware of the fact it's hard to have these kinds of conversations without lapsing into generality. But social media for research development is exciting when it's people experimenting, of taking up new technologies and trying to see how they can be used as part of their day-to-day scholarly activity. And I think we're seeing a shift in research culture that's emerging, which is very exciting on a number of levels. There's a newfound vibrancy to research culture when ideas in motion increasingly dominate, to use a phrase from the American philosopher Daniel Little. It's very exciting to see people working out ideas in public, the lived experience of ideas, something which in practice tended to be confined to personal exchanges, or maybe particularly vibrant discussions at conferences and during panels. And this is a very exciting part of the new research culture that is opening up. Exposing the scaffolding of these towering research outputs is something that I think has immense pedagogical value. And it certainly shapes my experience of the PhD process as someone who undertook numerous projects during my PhD, that if I had not seen many accounts of how to edit a book or things like that online, I doubt I would have had the confidence to do it. But the fact that I saw people describe the process of editing, putting together a special journal issue, putting together an edited book, allowed me to understand at an early stage how it worked. Whereas if all I'd seen was the finished products, I would have had a very different relationship to this kind of output. It allows real-time feedback and dialogue about work in progress. And this is the sort of thing that may be difficult at times. So people might share ideas too hastily and be criticised for them, or people might be subject to plagiarism. I do think the risks of these things are overstated, but they are real risks. And again, I'm not saying, therefore, that this is something everyone should do. Just that these are positive aspects that are emerging of a new research culture. And if we highlight these positive dimensions, we can also leave ourselves primed to recognise some of the difficulties and make informed decisions about how we engage in them. And it also allows dialogues across boundaries of discipline and field that I think are very valuable, simply because it's easier in terms of the time investment to read someone's blog from a different discipline than it is to regularly read journals from that discipline. It's easier to sustain ongoing conversations with people working on different fields than it is to try and occasionally go to a conference in a field that's not your own. We're all pushed for time, and as much as there is this sense of social media as something that can involve wasting time, these are actually quite efficient technologies in many ways. They allow us to form these kinds of connections and allow communities to emerge in ways that require a relatively minimal investment of time. It just involves creative use of them. Because time is something that comes up again and again in discussions of social media. How do you find the time? But if we see social media as scholarship, if we see what scholars do on social media as mostly scholarship, not always scholarship, but that's much like saying that conferences are not exhausted by the scholarship that takes place in them, but this is still the primary focus of them. And if we don't see social media as something additional over and above existing work, then the challenge of time starts to melt away. Because if what you're doing on social media is scholarship, then it becomes a case of what intellectual technologies you're using. Are these better for you? And they might not necessarily be. And so in this sense, this is all quite positive. And I think as much as there's anxiety about using social media as part of the research process, it's actually quite straightforward. There are practical issues around quite concrete matters such as copyright, ownership of ideas, how to use a particular platform. But these are relatively easy to surmount, and I think we are seeing an important change that is very visible increasingly within the UK academy, albeit that's spreading quite unevenly across disciplines and fields. But I think dissemination is actually much more problematic than this. And so if we think about what dissemination means, a good place to start is a dictionary definition. Dissemination means to spread widely. And on this level, it can seem straightforward why social media would seem to be useful. It's seen as vast new communications platforms used by vast audiences, which without much or any technical skill, we can quickly and easily use to communicate with those audiences. And so social media, on the surface of things, seems to be a powerful way to disseminate to audiences outside the academy. And conversely, we're in a changing institutional culture where the expectation of dissemination is growing. And so while there's still a lack of clarity about what impact means concretely, or what personal practices, what are the conditions, the cultural factors that lead to impact, social media becomes institutionally appealing on that level. Because if you're still not completely sure what an impact culture looks like, having your academics using social media can seem quite a good proxy. And for academics seeking to adapt to these new conditions, using social media can be a way of signalling your willingness to engage in impact activity. And sometimes things like Twitter followers, blog subscribers, can seem like proxies for impact capacity, but not necessarily impact. And so I think the perceived importance of social media for impact is coming from both directions. It's coming from academics keen to disseminate to a wider audience, embracing it from the bottom up, but also a growing pressure, a connection with the impact agenda, in which it's now seen as something that one has to do as part of the portfolio of obligations to which academics are subject. That teaching, research, but also engagement. And you demonstrate your capacity and willingness to engage through the use of social media. But the problem, I would argue, comes because of metrics. Metrics in the academy and also metrics on social media. The UK is already an incredibly metricized academic system. On one estimate, academics in the UK are potentially subject to over 100 different metrics. We're already primed to evaluate ourselves in quantitative terms, to place ourselves competitively, to rank ourselves and to compare our work to others. And we work within organisations, and we often forget that universities are organisations much like others. They are employers, and there are employees within them. And ranking in these organisations happens on the basis of metrics. This is already well established. It's part of the take-for-granted background to life within the UK academy. And there are many critiques that can be made of this, and I don't have any intention of making them today about the university. But all I want to highlight is that when you have an already metricised organisational culture, along comes social media, which is built around metrics. It's built around numerical measures of popularity. And the logic of social media platforms tends to reduce intellectual value to popularity. Popularity as measured by basically very crude rankings, like follower counts, tweets, retweets, favourites, reblogs. And I think some of the difficulties surrounding social media for dissemination comes when the metrics culture of universities runs headlong into the metrics culture of social media platforms. And we need to be very careful about this, because we're already so primed to think in terms of metrics that I think there's a risk we overinvest and begin to take these numbers too seriously, because we're used to taking numbers seriously. We're used to numbers having important consequences for our careers. And whatever criticisms we could offer of the use of numbers within higher education, I think the use of numbers on social media are infinitely more stupid. And if we're trying to use social media effectively for impact and engagement, a preoccupation with numerical measure can really get in the way of thinking strategically about public engagement as engagement with particular groups, for particular groups. Not trying to maximize the number of Twitter followers as an end in itself, but to see these things as means to an end, rather than an end in their own right. Because these platforms can generate unpleasant behavior. And this behavior is something that emanates from the platforms as sites for human interaction. If you've ever looked through a series of comments on a popular YouTube video, you'll very likely have seen these sorts of exchanges. If you haven't looked through comments on a popular YouTube video, I'm not sure you really should. It's depressing and you see the worst of people. But my point is that the nature of these platforms is something that it generates many things, because human beings are complex and human interaction is complex. But one thing it reliably generates is incivility, antagonism, aggression, and quite negative forms of interaction. Because social media, it rewards contention, it rewards reaction. The logic of the platform is such that the more of a reaction you generate, the more visible your communication, your action on that platform will be. You may get many retweets of a particular tweet that you put out. That doesn't mean they're positive, but it means that the more of a reaction you generate, the more visible what you've done will be. And there are many things that can create a reaction on social media. Controversy, sensationalism, lies, innuendo. And intellectual virtue is certainly one of them. Things can spread by virtue of the intellectual quality of the ideas, but it's certainly not the foremost. And I think we have to be very careful to note that social media platforms do not necessarily produce environments within which academic ideas easily thrive. And this is not an argument not to use them, because there are very powerful aspects of them which we can use strategically. But we need to be realistic about the kinds of challenges that we'll face when using them for what are relatively highbrow purposes, and recognise the extent to which there are temptations loaded into the platforms. If you're frustrated, if you have an expectation of a vast public out there waiting to interact with you, and then you find you get little response, the temptation to, in a creeping way, simplify what you're saying, recast it in more contentious ways, because you very quickly begin to see that contention is rewarded online. I think there's a very negative aspect of social media. We can use social media without falling into these traps, but we have to be aware of the traps from the outset to avoid them. Because I think if we see social media as a way to communicate with this undifferentiated public at large, we're liable to perhaps be disappointed when we realise that some of the public we meet on social media often aren't very nice to us. Not only will we encounter people perhaps who won't be interested in what we're doing, we can encounter people who are actually outright hostile to what we're doing. And I think if we have an overly enthusiastic view of social media, then we're liable to have a countervailing reaction if we encounter people being rude and aggressive online. And so I'm suggesting that we need to be aware of these as practical problems to prepare for contention, to be clear about why you think people will be interested in what you do. And to do that, we need to move beyond looking at the general public, because this is something that I think many people will recognise, but in practice, because social media is so new, we often haven't thought through the connotation in the same way we would other forms of communication. Because any one social media platform, the demographics are not representative of society at large. Plus, we never actually encounter the demographic whole of a social media platform. We don't encounter all Twitter users, we don't encounter all Facebook users. The users who see what we do online are defined through all sorts of complex means. We'll only ever engage with a particular subset. And so the fact that we might encounter people who are hostile to what we do does not mean that social media isn't going to be useful for us. But it does mean we should be clear about, if they're not the people we're trying to engage with, who are we trying to engage with? Because I think there's this influential idea of social media letting us bridge the gap between town and gown, destroy the walls of the ivory tower, radically democratise scholarship. And I think this is actually quite a dangerous myth, even. It misrepresents how social media works to engage with wider publics. And we need to move beyond this way of looking at it, even if it's just taken for granted background framing that we have as residue in our minds. Because otherwise, we lose sight of the opportunities that are really there. Because we're in an intellectual context and a political context characterised by increasing polarisation, increasingly hostile anti-intellectualism, arguably. And I think in this context, we need to be really careful about what we see social media as being able to do and what we see it as not being able to do. And recognise the fact that people might actually be very particularly hostile to opposition and things that might seem tokenistic about the importance of having dialogue rather than simply assuming that we have answers and we will broadcast them to wider society. These questions become very important. And what I'm describing is some of the myths surrounding social media. I think they make it more difficult to ask these questions systematically. And so the clearer we are about what these platforms can do and not do, the easier it is to think through these issues. And so to see social media as mechanisms to build relationships with specific groups, rather than as an end in themselves. And I think this leads us to ask questions like, who is the public that we're trying to engage with? What can we learn from them? What can we learn about them? What resources do we have to engage with them? Why do we think they'll be interested in what we do? And these are big questions, and they're ones that will invite a variety of responses in any group of academics. And I'm raising them at the end of the talk rather than at the start, just to illustrate that the answers to these questions do not necessarily involve social media. And I think if we see social media use in terms of a much broader framework of engagement and dissemination, then we can move beyond some of these problematic views that get in the way of effective engagement, and instead see who is it we're trying to engage with, why will what we do we hope what we do will matter to them, and how can we use social media not as a panacea, but as one tool amongst others for this end. And so today then I've talked about social media for research development and suggested actually this is the relatively straightforward issue. These are new ways of doing existing scholarly activities that are more open and dialogical. And I think increasingly people are deriving a lot of satisfaction, a lot of utility from using these as part of their work. And the best way to explore this is to simply pick them up and try and see what works for you, see what other people in your field, see what colleagues are doing. And if you see things that appeal to you, just try them. To get beyond the idea there's a right and wrong way to use social media as part of the research process. And instead just see it as an expansion of the technology available to us. This new and often exciting ways to do existing things. But we shouldn't fetishize it. It might not be useful for everyone, and ultimately it's a question of individual proclivity in the context in which you work. But on the other hand, social media for dissemination, I think, is an incredibly important issue for the university at large, for the role of research in society. And I think the context in which we're living is becoming more polarised and problematic, and there are really important questions about the role of academics in society, the role of academic research in terms of the wider social fabric, that social media is incentivizing us to ask. And I think to actually be able to ask those questions, both in terms of knowledge as a collective pursuit, but also in a more mundane way, our everyday use of activities, we have to move beyond these myths of social media and instead see it as something much more ambivalent and as one option amongst others. And so, yeah, hopefully that's given us some topic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We'll have lots of opportunities for questions a little bit later on, but before then, Kathleen Stocks kindly agreed to come along to give her response as an academic to what Mark's just talked about and some other ideas. Just to introduce Kathleen, her main interests are in the philosophy of fiction and imagination, and she's published widely on those topics, and she's currently completing a book for Oxford University Press on fiction, interpretation and imagination that's due out later this year. And she's also written articles recently on the nature of sexual objectification. And Kathleen is a reader in philosophy here at Sussex.
Thank you, and thanks for asking me. And the first thing to say, it's a bit of a demurral, but I'm not here as an expert. Absolutely not. I was asked to come as someone, I think Don put it very delicately, someone who's an emerging interest in social media or something like that, because somebody else dropped out. So, that's just to be honest. But I think my experience, so thanks, Mark, that's given me loads to think about in terms of my own use of social media. I think the way that I relate to social media probably is indicative of the way lots of academics feel about it, which is ambivalent. But we're tempted towards it, but also we're not very confident in using it, and we don't know what we're doing. So I'll talk about philosophy. That's the area I come from, and I assume that quite a lot of what I have to say will be relevant to the humanities generally. I'm not sure to what extent it will engage with people working in the sciences and their use of social media, for instance, as well, or the social sciences. In philosophy, I would say that the dominant social platform that philosophers use is Facebook. And it's quite a strange, I think sociologically interesting use of it, because philosophers, there's a big analytic philosophy community. I work in analytic philosophy. We pretty much all know each other in the States as well. And so we're all connected up on Facebook, or many of us are. And people who are very big names tend to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of friends, and including students and PhD students. And so there's this kind of pseudo-community of philosophers, most of whom have privacy settings set so that you can't see what's being said if you're not friendly with them, some of whom have public settings, and that's where a lot of discussion goes on about philosophy. So I would say, in terms of what Mark was saying, using social media for research, Facebook suits philosophers because A, there's no word limit to start, it's really quite hard to do research in philosophy with a limited character count. And so what happens is people argue, because philosophy is all about arguments. And so there's big long threads that when I go onto Facebook between various philosophers in different positions having massive long arguments with each other, and then PhD students chipping in. And from that perspective, it's obviously good, I think. It does some of the things that Mark was talking about in terms of opening up the back room, as it were, and making philosophy more collaborative than it usually is, because often it's just people stuck on their own thinking these things through. So I think that's all good, but at the same time it has some drawbacks. Firstly, it's kind of cliquey. You have to be in on the conversations, and you have to be friends with the right people, and there's clearly a sense of people on the outskirts feeling like they're not in the room. There's all these anonymous blogs in philosophy written by very disgruntled PhD students and postdoctoral students being absolutely, very, very angry at the way that they've experienced philosophy. And part of the thing they say all the time is, I saw on Facebook somebody said this, and people get very indiscreet because they think that they're talking to a kind of friendly room. The privacy settings are often wrong. So it can also lead to a lot of trouble, and I for that reason I find it really it doesn't work for me. I mean, I'm on Facebook, but I try just to keep it for nothing to do with my personal or my professional life. Even that is quite a strange mixture, because I'm still quite friendly with a lot of philosophers, so all friendly, Facebook friendly. So I really do think Facebook's strange if you're trying to combine it with your professional life and your pictures of your kids. It's a kind of strange mixture, and I see all sorts of pictures of people's kids all the time, people I don't know, and stuff about their marriages that people I don't know, because they're not relating to their audiences. So I think that's a really problematic aspect of Facebook generally, that you can't really control your audience in that way. So why I think Facebook attracts philosophers, apart from the word limit issue, or the lack of it, is that it's got this community building thing, and I also think philosophers generally are quite private and not very good at publicising themselves, so they like the sense that they're behind, as it were. And Twitter's terrifying to most philosophers, I think, because you're actually engaging with people you don't know. So I myself have gone to Twitter, and my main motivation was because I had a book coming out, and it was entirely cynical. I wanted to build up some kind of audience for this book in advance and interest in my work. So my book's on fiction and imagination, and what I've attempted to do is to mainly tweet about fiction and imagination, with a bit of stuff on objectification, which is another interest of mine. The thought was initially that I would get people who were interested in those things, rather than just me. I was trying to attract them by. There's lots and lots of people in the world interested in fiction, not just philosophers, but writers, readers, and I thought maybe I could build up some sort of following in that way. And my main source of follower is people who want to get their novels published. Basically, they follow me because they seem to erroneously think I have some kind of influence. I'm a robot. So that's what I did, but I think I don't always wholly succeed in only talking about fiction. I also use it to make jokes and tweet stupid things, and I'm okay with that, because I think partly what people want to follow is a human being, and I might have attracted people even that way around, who knows, but I think it's important for me anyway, to try and remember that I'm a personality, or I'm a person rather, not a personality, not just a kind of automaton constantly thinking about how this is going to go down with my followers, and I don't really want to get like that, so I don't. So I think my Twitter feed's a bit of a mess as a result. So the positives of Twitter are quite obvious, it seems to me, that you are engaging with a totally new audience, whereas on Facebook you're not. It's who you know, and you've met them before, and you vaguely know you. And there really is a thirst out there, I find, not for me, but I see it with respect to other academics on Twitter. There's a thirst for public intellectuals, and there's a real desire to get engaged in academic and intellectual discussion. So there are a few philosophers on Twitter, and they're very, very successful. There's one called Nigel Warburton, who has millions of, he has a podcast called Philosophy Bites, which has had 30 million downloads, and he has an agent. He has a huge amount of clout, simply through explaining clearly deep philosophical, complicated philosophical ideas to people. And I did actually do a podcast on Philosophy Bites recently, and that did bump my followers up quite a lot. So I can tell that there is this appetite out there. As far as I can see, the most successful academics in the humanities on Twitter tend to be ones who have a blog or a podcast or somewhere they can send people. So they're not just interested in, people aren't interested in you just if you're just tweeting tiny little bits of information. They want to be sent somewhere where they can read something longer and engage with it and then come back and tweet you about it. I haven't done that. I've considered it at various points and might do it, but I think that would be, if you wanted to build up some kind of reputation for your ideas, I think it wouldn't be enough to just be on Twitter. I think you need to be able to push them somewhere where you have an opportunity to say a bit more, particularly in humanities where it's all about the argument and not the conclusion, particularly it's how you got there is just as interesting as where you end up. So Twitter's just not going to fulfill the role that it might do if you were publishing some kind of scientific data in a news tweet. So another thing I was thinking about when I was listening was how it's great. I think it's obviously true that social media is expanding possibilities of research, but I think it's worth acknowledging that it also, at least in my discipline, is quite antithetical to doing the kind of research I do in terms of attention span. So, I mean, Twitter is if you're on Twitter, you are being fed bursts of information every 30 seconds from a massive range of topics and fields, and you end up with the attention span of a flea if you stay on there too long. And that's not the mindset I can possibly keep if I'm going to write 10 chapters on the nature of fiction. So I think that humanities research requires total concentration, focus, flow, and freedom from distraction, and Twitter is not going to provide you with that. So I do think, and actually a lot of people I see on social media, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're not producing much research. I think if you become a haven, look, I'm doing some work, I'm on Twitter, but you're not really, you're not necessarily doing the best kind of work. So I think academics generally, I don't know if there's anything in your book about this, about managing yourself from the temptation to be on social media all the time as some kind of substitute for real work. And whether you can balance the mindset required to be an efficient user of social media with the mindset required to be an efficient researcher of really hard stuff. I would say that's something to think about. So, yeah, I think that's about it, really, I'm afraid. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sure you'll have many questions for Mark.
Brilliant, thank you. Are there any questions straight away from people?
So in my field of research, we do blogs. Well, I do blogs, Facebook, Twitter, the whole sort of package. And we do the blogs, and then we put them onto Facebook, and then Facebook, I share it with our end users, and I find it's a really good way to get our research out to the end users. But the problem is, like you were saying, that it does seem to create problems in certain people with their negative comments. And I do find that quite a challenge sometimes to kind of be professional, which I am at all times, and it's very hard not to take it personal to yourself because you're the one that's representing your lab. So I think that's definitely something to be aware of, how you deal with people who will criticise your research because you're not doing it the right way, or your ideas contradict the way that they used to be doing it. And I sometimes struggle a little bit, that negative. And I don't know if is there a right or wrong way to deal with that. I don't know what your suggestions are.
It would be interesting if they are people who you might meet in a face-to-face contact.
We do sometimes, yes, because we have workshops, so they come actually to our lab. So yeah,
Are
it
they
is
more constructive in that context?
Sorry?
Are they more constructive in that context?
Yes, they are. Yeah, because I think when you're just commenting on Facebook posts, you don't get that emotional sort of aspect of, or limitations, because you're generally a lot politer as a society when you're speaking to somebody face to face. But in the end, you know, because you're not, then there doesn't seem to be the same barriers.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and it's a really important thing to recognise. And so there's not that emotional responsibility for the action. And also it's, you know, quick in the media, and people don't feel compelled to actually reflect on what they're trying to say, you know, to construct the argument they're making to you.
Yeah.
And I wonder increasingly if the corollary of that should be that we don't have a responsibility to respond to people.
Yeah, this is what I was wondering. Should I just post that and then just run away quick and kind of hide, or do I have to deal with all these negative comments afterwards? That's the thing.
I don't think there's an obligation to respond, and I think if you're clear about why you're not responding, and you could phrase this in many ways, you know, from the perhaps very assertive and maybe slightly aggressive. If you're going to be critical like this, you know, at least do me the service of sending an email or coming to a session and putting time and effort into it. But to just saying that we don't think this is the right forum for this kind of debate, that we run these participatory workshops, and this is where we like to have these kinds of discussions, and you're very welcome to raise these issues in that kind of forum.
I've got some thoughts on that as well, actually, because we get asked this question quite a lot in the communications team, and I always think that you do need to be aware that, you know, when you are going out on Twitter, you are opening up a conversation.
Yeah.
You are. Social media is its most influential when it is used as a conversational tool, and it's quite easy to take it in it's quite easy to take that criticism in, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Actually, sometimes what could actually be construed as a sort of slightly disagreeing with what you're saying, it's not necessarily a criticism. And I think the fact that you mentioned that when you meet them face to face, it's a very different conversation. You can come sometimes almost smooth it over by saying, you know, really interested in your thoughts, please come along and have a chat to us. And you're taking it offline, but you're showing us still.
I mean, there's only so many emojis you can put on there, trying to lighten it a little bit, but it's tricky getting that balance right, because you do want to respond, you do want to say, well, actually, this is the reason why we believe this research represents whatever it is, but also people have got very preconceived ideas on ways that they have been doing. I mean, I'm a bee researcher, that's where it comes from, so we do a lot of our research is tailored to our end user, so, you know, and they've got ideas of how they've been doing it for the last half of a century, so who are we to come and tell them how to do things, you know? So yeah, it's interesting.
I'd be interested, I think this speaks to the issue you raised about time and distraction, because I think being drawn into potentially
it takes ages sometimes to actually go through and just kind of defend our work, which is, you know, sometimes actually my husband said to me, why do you bother? And I said, yeah, but it's part of our job to do this, to get our research out there, and this is what we're expected of us. So we do it, but, you know, there is that comeback. And because Facebook, you have your personal name, it's sometimes, even though it's the whole lab's research, that you're kind of the one that has to deal with the fallout of it.
And it's draining very much as well,
yeah,
so the kind of task interruption of going back to something else becomes harder if people are berating you online.
And another tool you've got up your sleeve as well, especially if you're hosting it, you know, the space of 2 or 3 days, you can comment after comment after comment. Let them come out, and then 2 days later, say, post a blog post, like Mark said, blog post, great load of comments from everyone. Great opportunity to come back and hear our thoughts on some of the feedback you've got, and you can kind of bring everything together that way rather than, you know, staying up all night responding to everyone's, and then you get caught in the cycle.
Yeah, you do.
Some other questions? Yeah.
Both of you made observations about recognising your audience, or more particularly audiences. But you also made distinctions between public and private, and personal and professional. Does that mean that people should be thinking about multiple personas, potentially, depending on who they want to reach for what purpose? And Kathleen's observations about pictures of children in a context when you're linked with someone on a professional basis makes the point quite nicely. And I also echo some of Mark's comments about the danger of metrics. A couple of years ago, I remember hearing someone talk about a particular piece of work, and they weren't positive about the number of people who were tweeting on it. The number was irrelevant. It was the fact that one particular person had tweeted it, and that meant that it had an effect with the audience they wanted to, because it was someone, it was a policymaker who would take up that piece of work, and so it therefore made it all worthwhile, rather than one follower was the right one, rather than 20,000 wrong ones. So, would you like to comment a bit more about audiences, but also personas?
Well, all I could say is that some of my colleagues in the wider community have two accounts. They have Twitter on Twitter, they have a personal one and a professional one, although in every case they seem to just tweet each other. But also people do this on Facebook as well. I don't know if the settings, I don't know if it's officially allowed to have two on it, I have no idea, but people do have one sort of professional one and one private one. And I have thought about that a lot, but it becomes really hard to disambiguate the people you're friends with who are also your colleagues, and then to make a cut-off point. You know, I don't want it to make it too obvious about the people I've left or my personal one as opposed to the ones I've ditched. It all becomes a nightmare, and I wish I could start the whole thing again.
Like, so a few years ago, I tried to do that for Facebook and found that when I was making the selections, friends with this very obvious pseudonym for me then showed up in people's news feeds, and then lots of people did friend requests, and it just became intensely awkward when that happened.
I think Facebook's just inherently messy.
I've noticed that on Facebook, like many people who have a lot of followers, they usually do one personal account and then a page rather than another account for other people. So maybe that's easier to maintain the. So then you don't have to like tell people, call people your friends. Anybody can follow you, just according to their discretion.
Because I think there's lots of technical options like this, and they could be very effective. And I think if you're doing quite focused public engagement work, where you're aware of very distinct groups you're trying to engage with, and particularly if you're trying to engage with more than one group. Most of my experience with public engagement comes from trying to engage with advocacy groups in a particular community, and also trying to engage with journalists. And I was very aware, in a way that I never quite resolved, of the fact that communications with journalists were perhaps not how I should be communicating with people in the community. And so I think these dilemmas are inherent to public engagement when there's more than one audience we're trying to engage with. And social media gives an endless array of options to manage this in terms of personas and accounts. But the problem is that it's endless, and it's the time demands that can emerge from that. You know,
It's endless, and it's also, although I can see completely why you want to do that, there is a danger that if this ever emerges, if somebody from one group sees how you're talking to the other group, they might lose a sense of you as an integrated, authentic human being. I mean, you know, if you're really talking a completely different way to the advocacy group than you are to the journalists, then I would find that problematic if they found out if the advocacy group comes out. So I think you really have to be careful with what persona you want to present and how it fits with your other personas.
but I don't see these as fundamentally different kinds of dilemmas to the ones that we have in, you know, everyday communication. The difference comes from the practicalities of how that communication is mediated. And we have more control over the mediation, and it's the control that creates the difficulties and about how we exercise that control. But I think if we can bridge the boundary between seeing these as new kinds of dilemmas to, you know, existing kinds of problems that we have, it becomes easy to think it through. And we need a degree of literacy about the platforms to do that. But it's one that I think is becoming relatively widespread.
Just wanted to see what you thought about how this kind of possibly more formal sort of groups versus the more sort of informal groups. How merging an informal group and a formal group can actually positively influence the conversation. How you might actually say more informal things where you might not do in one sort of formal area, and how that kind of language is sort of maybe kind of required to sort of advance the conversation. And I kind of also wanted to comment about how that formality and informality how much you think it kind of bleeds into real life? How much do you think that conversation in general is being deformalised, and how that kind of possibly influences social conversations?
Could you give an example?
Of a how a
Like the kind of formal and informal groups, just to...
well, so in the case of a professional group, just how if everyone is, if there were no kind of informal conversations in a whole professional group, because no one had a personal account on that, then a conversation might go a certain way, and no one might feel as if they can say something which might be seen as too informal, which might need to be said. I'm afraid I can't think of a...
Sorry, yeah, I do see what you mean.
Right.
I mean, I'm really interested in the experience on Facebook for this, because I don't really use it very often, and I think in the fields that I work, Twitter is the norm. But I think it's such an interesting question, because I tend to think of, say, a conversation on Twitter as, like an everyday conversation, but it echoes in, it's a conversation in a crowded room, and people might be able to overhear you, but they probably can't hear you. And if they are overhearing you, it's because they are trying to for some reason. And it might be that the conversation echoes on in the room for a bit longer. But recently someone pointed out to me that actually people do read conversations on Twitter much more extensively than I tended to assume. And I wondered if this is something very different to platforms. And I was really interested in what you said about the kind of the feeling of the closed room. People think they're in a private setting and they're talking amongst
You
friends.
also breed resentment as well. If you're resentment, this sort of strained alienation, you're reading other people's conversations and their friends. And really, why are we doing this? Why am I listening to this conversation? Why am I reading this conversation? So, but that all sounds quite negative. I do think there's positive. If I've understood you right, there's a positive side to informality too. I mean, communication, as far as I can see, it's no different in academia to anywhere else. It thrives on things like empathy, humour, informality, spontaneity, and the most boring social media accounts are the ones that are very controlled and drone-like and always on message and always doing saying the right the sayings of the moment. And I don't want to be like that, so I couldn't be the way you suggest, either in life or on social media, and I think it works, to be honest.
I started my Twitter account in a previous life as a journalist, and so I've engaged with people in various different ways. As a journalist, then when I was transitioning into a completely different career, I was working in genealogy, so I've got genealogical followers. There's a rather odd subset who are into 1970s sci-fi.
Can I have them?
They're lovely, actually. And it fascinates me to hear the discussion from an academic point of view, because I've always, the whole time, shifting careers. As a journalist, I met academics who were interested in the work. I was a court reporter. So I got to know a lot of legal historians and criminologists and sociologists. They have been incredibly useful in pointing me in the right direction as I started to follow an academic route. And so from that point of view, I haven't even looked at disseminating research yet. But as a way of networking and making contacts, it's vital. I can't think of any other way of doing it, especially coming from the outside. It's really been a stepping stone to academia.
I think that's a really powerful thing that is easy to forget as we get used to it. And I think, while we were talking about cliquiness earlier, it occurred to me that, the other side of that is when social media can make conferences not cliquey. I'm a relatively shy person. I hate big conferences, but I love social media for this, because just through talking on the hashtag, you very quickly meet new people. And over time, academia can become more populated, and that informality can be very helpful. But it also allows you to approach people in a way you couldn't otherwise. You know, if you interact with someone on Twitter, it makes cold emailing them more likely to succeed in the group incremental way. But also it makes it seem more familiar, more comfortable as something to do. And you know, you can almost see that the density of connections within the academy is rising, and there are upsides and downsides to that. But if we are becoming more connected to each other, that seems on balance a positive thing to me. And I think experiences of going through the kind of transition that you're talking about are perhaps ones in which the usefulness of that is particularly pronounced.
And that also, your story also speaks to the positive side of this kind of cross-fertilisation of followers, because had you got very sort of rigid about it and wanted a clean kind of account which only had genealogy followers and another account which only spoke to your journalists and colleagues, you wouldn't have had this kind of potential cross-fertilisation. I mean, I think it made me think that I should carry on as I'm doing in a way, because it's tempting to want to get really kind of compartmentalised, but I can't control it anyway. So
Yeah.
I think most people understand that we're multifaceted. I mean, an example I often invoke for this is Paul Krugman's blog, and when he marked, one of the most popular bloggers in the world, and he marks posts for other economists as, I think, want blogs. And as someone who wants to follow those posts, I just ignore them now. And people are not surprised by the fact that we're talking to different audiences and acting in different capacities.
The question will definitely get to everyone.
I don't have a question. I really want to thank you, Dr. Carrigan. Finally, I get to see the person behind the blog that I've been following for years. One of the things that I took away from your blog and from this conversation is how important social media is for collaboration. Instead of just, because the topic was on dissemination, that was one part of it. But I think one way in which we use the blog and Facebook or Twitter or some multiple social media sites is just to create a collaborative network in which the knowledge is shared in that sense of actual use value. So some of the academics that I follow, for example, really tag other academics' work. Paul Krugman is one person who's popular, but otherwise it's just not merely disseminating our work, but just being in the loop within your or outside your, and that way you expand the horizon of your own learning. So, I mean, in that sense, it follows exactly the discussion, but I was just thinking that collaboration is such an intrinsic part of an academia that is bent on metric and on alienation in some ways.
I think you can make collaboration more accessible as well. I mean, I did my PhD part-time, and a lot of the time I was either working a whole sequence of jobs or at one stage working one full-time one with a big commute. And during that point, when I physically was not at university at all for about 6 months, I was very aware of social media as a lifeline, something that kept me hooked in, both a kind of symbolic sense of identity, but also having access to things people are reading. And the morning train from Coventry to London was so unpleasant that I could rarely do academic work on it. But I could read academic Twitter and read academic blogs and think about
them. Given what you've said about negative comments perhaps are encouraged on social media, or they're encouraged, but people tend to be easily give them, but there doesn't seem to be filters perhaps on people's comments, or that I'm thinking of the negative things. Obviously there's lots of positive things, but also that I think we said about sometimes it can encourage short attention spans and concentration. Is the use of social media for dissemination and development, can it be seen as slightly dumbing down research?
Yes,
I would say sort of, but I mean I'm completely, I agree with the vast majority of what was said on this. And I've been writing a book about digital distraction for 2 years. And I have this book planned out in great detail for every chapter, but I still need to actually sit down and write it. But I would want to at least analytically separate dumbing down from distraction. I think these are two different processes that often in practice overlap. And I'd approach the question of distraction from the sociology of time, about how our working life operates, the sequencing of activities, how much time we're able to allocate to something. And so social media can encourage particular uses in which we get sucked into it, with negative comments and responding to them being a particular kind of draining, arguing on the internet problem. But other issues where we don't have prolonged periods of concentration. But there's nothing intrinsic to social media that means we have to use it that way, but there are temptations loaded into it. And so I think it's important that we recognise the kinds of other technologies we draw upon. Things like social media blockers, things like the Pomodoro technique of ways of managing our time. There are really interesting writing technologies that have emerged through social media. So distraction through writing environments is something, there's now scores of these, and I rely on them. When I write in plain text on a blank screen, in a software that has no other options. And so I think ways in which we can have conversations about negotiating distraction are really important. But at present, we know relatively little empirically about how academics use social media in time, the rhythms of how they use it. And I think that's a really important avenue for research, to understand how people are actually using these things in their daily working lives. Because when I've interviewed academics about the use of social media, often they're incredibly strategic about it because they've got good at managing their time. And it's something that they dip in and out of. And so they still mark out particular windows of time, for concentrated work. But people often use social media from a phone or a tablet when commuting or in odd little snippets of time. But I say all this as someone who yesterday decided I need to be off Twitter for weeks until I catch up on the proposals and various other things that are underway. So, I do think it's easier to say this than to do it. But I think this conversation is very important.
I think, I'm actually surprised that academics use to block out periods of time. Who are these academics? Because all the ones I know are completely unable. They're either not on it at all, and they don't understand the point of it, or they're on it all the time. And our jobs, we're uniquely unfettered, unmanaged. We've basically, you've got your own day, you carve out your own timetable, you put your teaching in, and then you've got your research. And if you're on research leave, you've just got like 8 months to produce a book. No one will tell you off if you don't. Well, they will eventually, if you're impossible. But on a day-to-day level, you have to manage yourself. And of course, that's a massive challenge for most people. Academics are no different. Then you add social media and you're on your computer, all your work is on your computer. You're often having to keep the internet on to things like Wikipedia, important journals. So basically, you've got a prime situation for distraction. And I think it would be really good to be more honest about that and to have support for academics about how to manage that, because it is not a simple thing to sort out. And these people you're talking about must be incredibly disciplined. But I've used those social media platforms and I think they're useful.
I've come to rely on them, to be completely honest.
Yeah, we're being honest. Why not be honest?
Because you get sucked into it. But I do think we sometimes tend to mythologise the conditions of our own employment, to see it as something separate from knowledge work, to see it as something quite elevated. And I think in terms of how these issues operate at different career stages, for instance, that can be a particular problem. And so we were talking earlier about the kind of young scholars, the expectation of using social media. And anecdotally, the fact that postdocs are very aware of the fact that there are only so many academic jobs. And so the sense in which one feels the need to actually tick all the boxes, to excel at all these different activities, with social media engagement being one of them, I think is something that might lead people to get sucked into distraction, particularly if they quantify what they're doing. So, I want to prove that I'm really good at this. I'll pursue followers, I'll pursue blog post accounts. And I think it's a fascinating topic. And it's a really interesting lens through which to look at the university in terms of how we manage distraction, who gets distracted, who has the freedom to opt out of it, and how we negotiate this.
And you talked a little bit about managing different audiences. I was wondering if you have any more advice on that. If you know that you do want multiple audiences in the same, say, Twitter account, and then there might be like end users and other academics. Particularly as a PhD student, I find it really difficult to kind of juggle that, knowing that like people won't stay interested for that long potentially because I'm not a big name, I haven't got established research, so it's like I've almost got to keep everyone engaged and hold on to people who have shown an interest. So just if you have any advice on that area.
I think it's easy to overestimate the extent of the problem insofar as that people don't always see everything. And so if you haven't already, it's interesting to look at the metrics, the analytics that are built into Twitter now. So they used to only be available to advertisers. Now everyone has access to them. And see the proportion of people who are seeing every tweet. And I think if you look at it in that light, the fact that you are talking to different audiences won't necessarily be a problem because not everyone's seeing everything. It obviously won't be as neat as that people are always seeing the right messages. But I think the risk of alienating people is, you can overstate that in this very distracting environment. But so maybe you could see it in terms of extreme cases. So not the general problem of how to talk to multiple audiences, but are there ever things you want to say to one audience that might put off another audience? I first started thinking about this when I discovered that my students were following me on Twitter. And I suddenly felt a lot more uncomfortable about talking about politics on Twitter than I had previously. And so, because this condition of what gets called context collapse, these different audiences, is something inherent in social media. But in terms of managing it practically, if we think about the risks of actually alienating different groups, that can sort of circumscribe the concern.
Okay. I wanted to thank you guys for all the inputs that you gave. I'm from the physics department, and my research deals with black holes and quantum gravity, and I wanted to raise this point that one of the very funny things that physicists face is on the lines of dumbing down your research to be on social media. It's like when you put out something as a popular science medium, and then everybody starts feeling like, oh, this is all so easy, why can't, we have all the answers, and then you get loads of emails having loads of different theories of how everything we are doing is wrong and how everything, everyone has the right answers. And that was another aspect of when to reply to people who are not specialists or not in academia at all, and who seem to feel that they have all the answers, and when not to. So that's one thing that as a PhD student I'm struggling to understand, because I see academics in my area who are really famous also having the same issues, and sometimes they come up with articles saying, no, it is not all that easy, and everything has a lot of mathematics behind it. And there was another question I wanted to ask about what do you think about linking different social media accounts like Twitter and Facebook? Because it seems like if you write short tweets on Twitter and then it gets on Facebook, there can be like a huge comment list in 2 different platforms, and then you get like crazy that, okay, I don't want anything and I'm going to shut everything else down, So I'm kind of confused how to deal with that.
I think the second question is quite straightforward, and we could talk about the first one, which I think is a really interesting issue. Like in terms of linking, I think it's a really effective way of managing the timelines and managing distraction. And you just need to be careful about the different character of them. So for instance, if you're tweeting much more regularly than you might use Facebook, a lot of people will find it a bit irritating to have the constant series of short updates.
Yeah.
And so there are plugins you could use that allow you to mark a tweet as for Facebook, for instance.
Okay.
So only ones tagged FB would go onto Facebook. But I think as long as you're aware of the different channels and what works and what doesn't for them, it can be a very good strategy to post on multiple channels at once. And it's a way of people will like to follow what you're doing in different ways. It's just giving them those different routes to engage with you. The first question, I'd never thought about that in terms of physics. I'm now wondering what Brian Cox's mailbag is like.
I've seen a few tweets from him related to these things as well.
Can I add something to this? I think this question is very interesting, also in light of the fact that the major the funders and the major educational authorities, they see actually, and they promote public engagement on social media as a way of almost validating research questions and as a quality assurance mechanism. And they tend to treat the public as a unified audience, like one that has one identity, the broader public, without distinguishing and specifying characteristics. And I've always found that quite problematic, in the sense that I wanted to ask, does this ever happen? do you have examples where actually the non-specialized public have managed to influence the formulation or the shaping of research questions? And if this has not happened, or it's not happening, or it's not perhaps appreciated as such because there is not the time to go into the individual theories of the non-specialized audiences, why is it encouraged as such? Because if you read hefty blogs or blogs from funders, it is quite a strong incentive for academics on and why they should go on social media.
To give you an example I saw a few days ago, I was at an event about the Concealed Reveal project, I think it's called, and it's an archaeological project looking at concealed objects that are found in the walls of houses, and so there's multiple theories about what these are, but what makes it really interesting from my point of view is that there's no discursive record of this. It's a practice that no one ever wrote about but really took place on a grand scale. And they were talking about some of the opportunities and difficulties of using social media to crowdsource concealed objects. And I think they said they found 400 in total. And so this is not the general public, but this is particularly members of the public who, through an appeal to a general audience, got in touch and they found archaeologically relevant objects. And I thought that was quite a nice example of how that dynamic can work really effectively, but then some of the problems that happen when they have to negotiate the fact that these people found these objects deeply significant. They wanted to find them in their own way, but they also wanted the experts to validate those definitions. And so it's complex, but I think the opportunities and value can be overstated, but there are concrete examples of it being there. But I think these questions talk to each other really nicely about expertise, and I think there's a rhetoric of co-production that can sometimes obscure the fact there are objective differences in expertise, and furthermore that the expertise can be one of the things that motivates public engagement. People want to get expert feedback, and then it becomes ethically as well as practically how to respond to that. Because obviously the easiest thing for you to do would just be to ignore these.
I think that most academics, and at least physics, they actually do go through all these theories and try to engage with the public, because one big motivation is seen as to bridge the gap between the expert knowledge between the common people and the so-called intelligentsia or whatever, and also that you have to give a reason why our research is being funded by tax. And also, interestingly, it has led to some job creations where scientists are doing something like talk to a researcher, and people actually pay them to talk about their theories and to learn why their theories are not correct. And
sorry, what's that called? I don't know.
If you go to, there's a blog called Back Reaction by Sabine Hosselfelder, and she actually has started doing this talk to a scientist, and she gets paid by the hour now. And I just had one related question before I'll shut up. So I'm a poet as well as a physicist, and sometimes I find these two persona being mixed up. Like, I don't know how to manage promoting both of the persona on social media. For example, I have a poetry book, and okay, I'm doing some kind of research, and then people tend to mix them up, and then it never comes out the way that I want to. Like, for example, the interviews or something, every time they are just mixed up, and nothing comes out standing very well. So I was wondering if you had some advice on that.
Well, I mean, no, I don't think so. I mean, that sounds like a much more dramatic version of a kind of dilemma I have, which is that I work on sexual objectification and I work on fiction, and there are people, there's a whole bunch of people interested in feminism and sexual objectification that are not at all interested in fiction and vice versa. And I haven't resolved it, and I've actually just taken solace in what Mark was saying earlier about how that's just how life is, and we have different aspects, but I mean, that's not going to be that practically helpful. So.
My primary experience is quite a lucky one, I guess, because I have a comparable thing in terms of social media and social media policy and higher education, and my research more narrowly construed, but they're relatively complementary.
Right.
So, my PhD was about the sociology of internal conversation, the sociology of life planning, and my work since then has been about social change and how we conceptualize a little technology in it. So although it's much more specialised than the work I do on social media and higher education, it actually fits relatively well, I think.
I'd be tempted to say that that is the coolest combination ever.
Exactly the same
Why would
thing.
you want to separate them out?
I tried to bridge them by writing a poem about gravity. About what?
It's a simple thing, but there might just be some things you can do in terms of your description or your bio that you attach to the different items. Actually, you can find some ways of doing that. You can speak to people in my team if you want some.
Yeah, I would want some advice with that, yes.
Yeah. No problem. Go.
I was just going to see whether Kathleen or Mark had any thoughts on one of the sharper ends of all this, which is really around social media and state authorities. So I think there's a bit in your book, Mark, where you refer to an academic who was questioned by a US border guard over a blog post that he had written when he made reference to some drug consumption that had happened many years earlier. Hadn't ever thought that this was particularly significant, but it was brought up when he was attempting to enter the US. As we know, at the moment, there's a kind of increasing focus on governments keeping people in or out in crossing borders, and academia is a very internationalized profession. Movement across those borders is very important to the profession in all kinds of ways. So when the authorities want to know whether they're letting the right people in or out, social media apparently provides quite an ideal place to go, doesn't it? Because there's this thing that's kind of like perhaps a stream of consciousness of all the person's thoughts if they've used it in that way or appeared to use it in that way. And academics are perhaps particularly vulnerable in that they're not only driven to share ideas that may be controversial, but also to share them at some length with some bodies of evidence behind them and with other groups who may then go on to use them. So in that context, what do you do with all that? How far do you self-censor? And given that, I mean, people do need to travel, there's a lot of focus on the US at the moment, but it also applies very much with states that have had kind of difficulties in or have had harsh policies on border control for much longer. Thinking of some academic colleagues who travel to some of the Gulf states very often, for example. So, any thoughts on that kind of territory?
It's a brilliant question, but can I come back to you and actually give it some really proper thought?
Yes, it's a brilliant question. I'm going to America next week, so I don't think I'm something about drugs. But I think it sounds like it's a dilemma for all of us to some degree. I mean, many of us will have areas of our lives that very conservative governments might not be that approving of. I'm not sure it's much worse. I think it's a matter of degree rather than just kind of like the same dilemma applies, but perhaps we face it more acutely. I don't know. You can travel a bit more, maybe. I've done nothing I've ever worried about. And I guess if you started to worry about it, then you would just face a classic moral dilemma. Do I stand up for what, do I publicly proclaim what I think is correct, or do I be quiet? And that's not something I have any particular expertise in answering.
And I think we're often frame social media in terms of this dominant idea of openness, and I think it's important when considering the kinds of factors that you're raising to recognise that rendering something open in this way renders it transparent, it renders it susceptible to surveillance. And I guess that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? And a political context in which surveillance might expand and be sanctions attached to speech acts or records of non-speech acts might increase over time. And so we go from a very specialised topic of academics using social media into the massive topic about the authoritarian drift in late democracies, which I guess goes beyond the remit. But I think it's very interesting, and I'm going to be thinking about the question for a while, I think.
Thank you very much for your presentations. You might have touched upon this, but I have a question about whether social media actually allows for well thought of, deep responses to people's questions, because I've noticed that sometimes people post something and I really want to check the date for reference or give it a bit of thought, and by the time I come back, people have moved on to something else. Which, when this happened several times, I thought maybe this is not the right platform to actually discuss that, which actually, in turn, gave me a certain idea about social media as not particularly relevant for that kind of in-depth conversations. I also felt that because I set up my own website in addition to my university profile as a lecturer, where I put in some thoughts and ideas about things, but because things develop very quickly, every now and then I look at the website and I feel somebody else's doesn't really reflect how I feel now. Hence the pressure that you talked about of constantly wanting to update or constantly wanting that to reflect who I am, and whether that actually becomes a burden, an additional burden on your work as an academic. So I guess my question has two parts: whether social media is actually relevant for that kind of in-depth and peaceful thinking that is required for certain questions, and second, how to deal with that kind of fast-developing nature of social media, which puts you under that pressure of constantly wanting to develop. And I know a very prominent academic has actually shut down his blog because he felt that, I don't have something to say this month, and everybody's waiting. And either he doesn't like to write because he has to write. He used to write because he had something to say, but because everybody was like, okay, where, so maybe some insights.
I just think Diana, I think you're right. I think that disseminating that a limited number of characters, a very small number, is not the right forum for argument and discussion in any meaningful way. It tends to misunderstand you very quickly. You can't get tone across. You can't get complexity across. It also butchers English and it makes it terrible. So I know academics who say, I just don't engage in that. That's not what it's for. If you want to discuss this with me, then we'll do it somewhere else. And I think that would be me. I just wouldn't get into that. I know philosophers who sit in conferences tweeting the things that people are saying. I just think it's pointless, because in philosophy, one sentence divorced from its context isn't going to convince you of anything. It's the whole body of propositions put together that are the argument, not just the single ones. And then on your other point, I remember when philosophers started using blogs and quite a lot of them do, I was kind of outraged inwardly, because I thought, this is the antithesis of the peer review process. We craft these things, and there's a reason why there's a peer review process to really make them good. And now we just have this medium where people are just like vomiting onto the page every day, and lots of people are reading it and citing it, and there are philosophers in my discipline who've got real names for themselves through really rubbish philosophy because it's on a blog. And it's become popular, it's been engaged, it's cool, it's got nice graphics, it's talking about sexy things. And I don't like that development at all. I think there's a reason peer review, like I say, peer review work is peer review. So, I'm sympathetic to that sort of work.
I'd see it as part of the duality of these things, and fundamental technology is it's a fundamental ambivalence, but I would recognise and agree that peer review is important, but social knowledge has demonstrated that there are things like citation cartels, the conservative version in peer review. These are not peripheral deviations, these are things that I think are integral to peer review. And I think part of it depends on the field that you're in. So I think in analytic philosophy, my memory of it is as a student at least, there is a relatively high degree of agreement about what constitutes good and bad philosophy. And in other fields that's much less the case, for sociology in the UK being quite an extreme example, where there's very little agreement on anything. And I think this is one of those issues where your orientation to peer review will be partly shaped by the discipline that you're from, and the relative value of social media will change. But rather than say that it's, can't oppose the good to the bad, I just think there are counterexamples that are relevant. Daniel Little, who's a fairly esteemed philosopher of science, I mean, he's probably my favourite academic blogger. And when I interviewed him for the book, he described to me the process of being a chancellor at a large American research university, and that social media was something that allowed him to sustain his scholarship because he lost the ability to block out sustained periods of time to write philosophy of science work. And he produced a book in the time that he's been chancellor, but it's an iterative process building up through the blog because it allowed him to cumulatively build scholarship in chunks of an hour or 2 hours based on continuous reading. And the administrative demands something like that is subject to, or probably relatively unusual. But I'd like to situate this in terms of the changing temporal pressures of academia, the extent to which the pace of academic lives are accelerating, the expectations we're subject to are increasing without more time available to do them. And we adapt to those, sometimes in quite negative ways, in terms of letting things slide, not prioritising things unless they're mandated. Certain things like, if you edit a journal, the difficulty increasingly of getting people to review articles, anecdotally that's increasing hugely, and that's an example of people adapting. But equally, I think social media offers some possibility for positive adaptations. I think the broader temporal structures of the changing university are a problem. The fact that more and more of us spend more of our time rushing, that's a problem. But we could see social media as, in some ways, making that problem worse, but in other ways offering solutions to it, new ways of working that can allow us to adapt to it. And so I'm not sure if that was a very clear answer. I guess I'm saying I sort of agree, sort of disagree.
Well, what I get from that is that you need to be purposeful, basically, in how you use it, for what purpose. And it's not an either or situation, basically.
That is an incredibly clear statement of what I'm trying to say.
I'd also say your point about it being a bit exhausting, if you've got your own blog, having to write something every month and to keep that going, there are other ways of just doing a one-off blog. So you could do it on a conversation, or you could do it on a post, or you could, there could be somewhere else you could speak to somebody in the comms team, or you could pitch your blog to another site. So you don't necessarily have to host something yourself and it to be really exhaustive. You can kind of find ways to get a one-off piece underway.
Yeah, I think that's going to be incredibly useful because then these sorts of sites, they already have the audience there for you to tap into. And so it's a way of engaging when you have something that issue you want to engage in.
You both talked a lot about social media, so seeing new ways of working for existing scholarly activities. But I noticed you both, in the process of publishing with very traditional publishers, and I wondered whether you felt there was any role for social media in disrupting traditional forms of scholarly communication.
Blogging kind of is in a new way, because it's bypassing the whole process. And sometimes, I like to part of like consider this process, but sometimes I have been tempted to just bypass the publication process and just put it out there. I want people to read articles. They sit there for 4 years, being batted back and forth from journal to journal, referee to referee, and getting deformed out of full recognition of the process. And just think, just have a website and start linking to it. So it's tempting to say that, but I haven't had the guts myself. So it's the rat. The most important thing.
I think that's the crucial issue, and my experience has been that all I ever really wanted to do was write books, and I drifted into academia for that reason, and then very rapidly realised that actually my idea of what academic life is like is a little bit outdated, and indeed it was ever true. But I still am someone who I primarily want to write books, and I'm aware of the necessity of negotiating journals, but my experience of publishing journals has predominantly been frustrating, slow, and it's not been one I've enjoyed. The experiences of peer review that I've really valued have come primarily from books produced as part of a collective project where there's some shared agreement about what the purpose of the project is, and input in that form. And so, I see the opportunity of social media to disrupt as, in practice, for me at least, more leading me to ask, so what is the purpose of publishing? If it's to get ideas to a relevant audience, then blog might be a better way of doing that. If it's because I want to develop a line of thought into a systematic whole, and then have that be an expression of that line of thought that I then move on from, the book is the thing that's always appealed to me deeply ever since I was a kid. And in the middle are journal articles, which in essence I see as something that I have to do. And I will do to the maximum extent I have to. And then instrumentally the advantage of social media is that even at this stage in my career, social media seems to improve the citation rate of my journal articles. But it's something that I'm very instrumental about journals, because I realise that I can't work in a university and not publish in them, even though I kind of wish that I could. So maybe one day there will be a disruption, and that could be a good thing.
Any more questions? No? I think that's it. Yes, just more check. No. Yeah, thanks very much, Mark and Kathleen. I think there's, do you want me to just, there's something else coming up? Just saw that. There is a session on planning for REF 2021. How to plan and publish with REF in mind. So this is...
No blogging.
Yeah. This is on Thursday the 6th of April, 12 till 2, in this same room here.